The teapot's lid clicked against porcelain, soft as a held breath, and Mira counted the steam rising off the jasmine leaves the way her mother had taught her. 3 curls, then pour. Steady hands, steady heart. The kitchen smelled of warm clay and crushed petals, and somewhere above her, through 3 floors of marble and old stone, the entire Velmora court was holding its breath for the same reason it always did on a Sunday. A new woman was about to be presented to the king. "Tray's heavy today," said old Hessa, nudging a second pot toward her with one knuckle, the joint swollen and permanently bent from 40 years of kneading dough. "Cook wants the rosehip blend up first. King's been snapping at the steward since dawn." Mira didn't look up. "He always snaps before the parade." "Don't call it that where the matchmaker can hear you. She calls it that herself." Mira wiped a smear of honey off the tray's lip with her thumb, unbothered. The way she was unbothered by most things in this house that made other servants flinch. She just doesn't smile when she says it. That part curdled the air a little, the way truth often does in a kitchen built on pretending. Because the title wasn't a joke below stairs. It was a wound the whole household kept pressing on. Every week for 19 weeks running, the Alpha King of Velmora had walked a different noblewoman through that long hall under the wolf-carved arches, presented her to his court like a question he already knew the answer to, and then, within days, sent her home. Flowers wilting in vases nobody bothered to empty. Names the steward stopped trying to remember. Mira lifted the tray. Porcelain rattled, faint and silver, like wind chimes in a house with all its windows shut. She had no reason to think today would sound any different. Up in the hall of petitions, King Calder Vesh stood with his arms crossed and his jaw already tight, and he hated how familiar the tightness felt. The doors groaned open. Another woman walked through them on her father's arm, draped in dyed silk the color of dried blood, her chin lifted at an angle clearly rehearsed in a mirror. She smelled of crushed lavender and nerves, an old combination he could have picked out blindfolded by now, because they all smelled like that. Lavender to mask the sweat, nerves underneath it, sharp and metallic. No matter how good the silk, he searched for it anyway, the way he searched every week, helpless as a man patting his own pockets for a key he's already lost. Some shift in the air, some thread pulling tight in his chest, low and certain. The bond pull every wolf was supposed to feel once, in a lifetime, when the right scent finally crossed the right nose. Nothing. Lavender. Nerves. A pretty mouth saying pretty things about trade routes she didn't understand. "Your Grace." The matchmaker's voice arrived at his elbow before her scent did. Orris root and old parchment, a smell that had started to mean disappointment to him the way a bell means dinner. Petra Ilsworth had matched 4 kings before him. None of them had ever made her this gray around the temples. Lady Wren of the Coastal Hold. Exceptional bloodline, exceptional manners. "Exceptional," Calder repeated, flat, and watched the word land on Petra's face like a slap she'd been braced for. He didn't mean to be cruel. He simply couldn't make himself care, and not caring, after 19 weeks of trying, had started to feel like its own kind of grief. From the gallery above, half hidden behind a column carved with running wolves, Lady Soren Hale watched the new candidate with her arms folded and her lip curled just slightly. Not enough to be improper, just enough to register if you knew where to look. Soren had survived 4 weeks of her own presentation, longer than most, and she intended to survive a great many more. She smoothed the silver fox fur trim at her collar. The only piece in court dyed that particular frost white, a vanity she'd never once apologized for, and watched Lady Wren curtsy too low, like a woman bowing to a throne that wasn't yet hers. She won't last, Soren murmured to no one. She was right. She just had no idea, standing there in her fox fur and her certainty, how soon her own reign as the almost favorite would end. Or what would end it. The tea arrived at the worst possible moment, the way good and terrible things so often do. Mira came through the side passage with the tray balanced against her hip, weaving between stewards too important to apologize for blocking her path, and stepped into the hall of petitions just as Lady Wren's voice cracked on the word honored, and the king's expression went, very visibly, to stone. She wasn't supposed to serve the main hall. That was Greta's post, and Greta was 3 days into a fever that had the whole staff terrified of catching it, which was how Mira had ended up with a tray of jasmine and rosehip, and absolutely no instructions about where to put either. She chose the side table near the king's chair because it was closest, and because her arms were starting to ache, and because, if she was honest, which she usually was, mostly with herself, she had never once in her life cared whether a king was watching her do her job. That, it would turn out, was precisely the problem. She set the rosehip pot down first, angled the handle toward his hand the way her mother taught her. Always toward the hand that will reach for it. Never make a man search. And only then did she catch it. Not a sound. Not a sight. A scent, cutting straight through the lavender and orris root, and old marble dust like a blade through silk. Warm cedar and rain on stone. Something low and clean and furious, rolling off the king in waves he clearly didn't know he was giving off. Mira's hands didn't shake. She'd trained them not to. But something low in her chest did. One single pull, sharp as a hook set deep, and she had just enough sense left to step back from the table before her knees did something humiliating. She did not look at him. She had absolutely no intention of looking at him. Calder smelled her before the pot finished settling on the table, and for 3 full seconds his mind simply refused to process what his body already knew. Crushed jasmine. Warm skin. And under it, under all of it, something that hit his chest like a thrown stone. Green tea leaves and rain-wet wool. Faint wood smoke. Home. Though he'd never once associated that word with anyone in this hall in 19 weeks of trying. The bond pull hit him like a dropped weight in his sternum. He turned his head before he could stop himself, and found a tea servant in plain gray wool already stepping back from the table, eyes down, hands folded. A woman doing precisely what every serving girl in this palace had been trained to do, which was disappear in plain sight. She was not beautiful in the way the hall was used to. No silk, no paint. Dark hair pulled back hard enough to ache. A faint white scar through one eyebrow that someone had clearly stitched in a hurry, years ago, by candlelight. But the pull in his chest didn't care about silk. You. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. The whole hall stilled. Mira looked up. She had to, when a king spoke directly at you. Even she knew that much. And found gold eyes locked on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with tea. Your Grace? Steady. Mildly curious. The exact tone she'd use if a customer asked whether the kettle had boiled. Calder opened his mouth. Found, for the first time in 19 weeks of practiced small talk with women whose names he'd already forgotten, that he had absolutely nothing to say. The tea is fine, he said finally, which was true, and also the stupidest thing he'd said in a decade. Mira's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something drier. I should hope so, Your Grace. I made it. She curtsied, correctly, not too low, and left. Behind her, Lady Wren stood mid-sentence with her mouth still open on whatever pretty thing she'd been about to say next, watching the king's eyes track a tea servant's retreating back instead of her own carefully arranged face, and understanding, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just watched her own chances die in real time, that she would not be invited back next week either. The Kitchens learned about it before the ink dried on the steward's log. He spoke to her directly, Hesse reported, scandalized and delighted in equal measure, kneading dough with more force than the dough strictly required. Twice, in front of the whole hall. He spoke to her because she put the pot down crooked, probably, said one of the younger girls, though nobody believed that, least of all her. Mira set her own tray down at the long table and said nothing, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing she could have done. She had never been a girl who blushed easily or filled silences with nervous talk. She'd grown up in a one-room cottage on the eastern border with a mother who'd raised her on the philosophy that a still tongue kept a sharp mind, and she had carried that into every kitchen she'd ever worked in since. But her hands, when she reached for the kettle, were not quite steady, and she hated that they weren't. It means nothing, she told herself, the way she'd tell a child not to fear thunder. He looks at every woman like that. It's his job to look, except it wasn't. Not really. And some small, traitorous part of her chest knew that already, the part still humming faintly from a scent like cedar and rain that she could not, for the life of her, stop thinking about. She poured herself a cup of the same rosehip blend, just to see if it tasted any different now that she knew it had touched his hand. It didn't. It tasted like rosehip. She drank it anyway, slowly, and told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. By Tuesday, the king had requested tea sent to his study 3 times. By Wednesday, he had specifically asked, through a steward too uncomfortable to phrase it plainly, so he'd dressed it up in 6 extra words, that the new girl, the one with the scar, be the one to bring it. Petra Ilsworth heard this 4th hand, and went very still over her ledgers, the kind of stillness that came right before she did something decisive. She found Mira in the herb pantry, sorting dried chamomile from dried yarrow by smell alone with her eyes half closed, a skill that had taken her years and that she performed now with the casual ease of someone shelling peas. "You," Petra said without preamble. "What did you do to him?" Mira opened her eyes, poured his tea. "He hasn't requested a candidate by name in 19 weeks, and you've been in this palace 11 days. "I didn't ask him to request anything." Mira set the chamomile aside, unhurried. "If you're worried I've enchanted him, I haven't got the coin for bond charms, and I wouldn't waste it on a king if I did." It should have sounded insolent. It came out simply honest, which was somehow worse, and Petra found herself studying the girl's face the way she studied bloodlines, looking for the tell, the angle, the ambition hiding underneath. She found none. That unsettled her more than ambition would have. "He is going to ruin you," Petra said finally, not unkindly. "Not on purpose. He doesn't know how to want something gently. He'll burn through you the way he's burned through every woman in that hall, and you'll be the one who has to live with the ash because kings don't." Mira held her gaze. "Then I'll be careful not to catch fire." She believed it when she said it. That, more than anything, was the flaw she didn't yet know she carried. The quiet, stubborn conviction that she could feel a pull this strong and still keep both feet on solid ground. That wanting him could be managed the way she managed a kettle at full boil. Controlled, contained, never spilled. She had no idea yet how wrong that would turn out to be. The forced proximity arrived 4 days later, and it arrived through blood, not design. Calder had been hunting border wolves along the northern tree line, rogue shifters testing the pack boundaries the way they did every spring, restless with the thaw, and came back through the kitchen entrance instead of the main gate, because the main gate meant guards, and questions, and a counsel that would want explanations he didn't have the patience to give. His shoulder was torn open from a glancing claw strike, blood soaking dark through his shirt, and he was furious in the specific, helpless way wolves get furious when injured. Cornered animal furious, snapping at anyone who got close. Mira was the only one in the kitchen at that hour, banking the fire for morning. She took one look at him, gray-faced, jaw locked, blood dripping steady onto the stone floor in a sound like a leaking pipe, and didn't ask permission before she was moving. "Sit," she said. "I don't need—" "Sit, or bleed standing. Your choice, Your Grace, but the floor's mine to clean either way." Something in his chest cracked open at that. Not the wound, something older. Because no one had spoken to him like that in years. Not his counsel, not his guard, not a single one of the 19 women paraded through his hall. He sat. She worked fast and without ceremony, tearing clean linen into strips, pressing one hard against the gash while he hissed through his teeth. Up close, his scent hit her in full force. Cedar, rain, and underneath it now, copper blood and something rawer, something that smelled like fear, which made no sense on a king built like a mountain until she realized. Not fear of the wound, fear of something else entirely, something he'd buried under 19 weeks of indifferent faces. "You're not screaming," he said, through gritted teeth, watching her hands work with a steadiness that didn't match the wild thudding she could feel in her own throat. "Would screaming help the bleeding?" "No. Then I won't bother." He laughed, short, surprised, pained, and the sound did something to her chest that the scent alone hadn't managed. "Most people scream around me," he admitted, quieter now, gold eyes fixed on her face instead of the wound, or go silent in the other way, the careful way, like I might bite. "You might." She didn't look up from the bandage. "But not tonight. Tonight you're bleeding on my clean floor, and that's the more pressing problem." His laugh this time came out rough and unwilling, like something dragged loose from underneath years of weight. It took an hour to clean and bind the wound properly, and somewhere in that hour, without either of them deciding to, the silence between them stopped being awkward and started being something else. Warm and dense, the kind of quiet that hums. "Why this work?" he asked finally, when the worst of the bleeding had slowed and she'd settled into rebinding the linen tighter. A girl who reads herbs by scent with her eyes shut could find easier work than scrubbing floors for nobles who never learn her name. "I like the kitchen." Mira tied off the bandage, neat as a knot in rope. "Nobody asks me to be anything in it. I pour the tea, I keep the fire, I go home and sleep without wondering whether I said the wrong thing to the wrong person. That sounds lonely." "It sounds peaceful." She met his eyes for the first time since she'd started working, steady, unflinching. "Which is more than most people in this palace seem to manage." He studied her in the firelight, the scar through her eyebrow, the calm set of her mouth, the way she hadn't once, in a full hour, asked him a single question designed to flatter or impress him. Every woman who'd walked through his hall in 19 weeks had asked him questions shaped like mirrors, wanting to see herself reflected back as chosen. This one hadn't asked him anything at all. "What's your name?" he said. Truly, not the steward's version. "Mira. Mira." He said it slow, testing the shape of it, the way a man tests ice before he puts his full weight down. "I'd like to keep hearing it." She felt that land somewhere low in her stomach, a heat that had nothing to do with the banked fire beside them, and she made herself look away first, toward the bandage, toward the blood-soaked linen on the floor, toward anything that wasn't his face in firelight, because she could already feel the danger in how easily she wanted to keep looking. "You should sleep," she said instead. Wounds close faster with rest. Is that a dismissal? It's good medicine, Your Grace. He rose, slower than he wanted to, favoring the bandaged shoulder, and paused at the kitchen door with his hand on the frame. Calder, he said, when it's just us, not Your Grace. He left before she could decide whether to answer that, which was, in its own way, exactly the answer he wanted. The almost moments started stacking after that, week over week, each one a little closer to the edge than the last. There was the morning he came down to the kitchens before dawn, claiming he couldn't sleep, and sat across the work table while she ground cardamom for the morning blend, and they talked, really talked, about nothing important, about the eastern border town where she'd grown up, and the way her mother used to read Storm Scent off the wind 2 days before it broke. He listened the way no one listened to her, fully, without already composing his reply. There was the afternoon his hand brushed hers, reaching for the same teapot handle, and neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds, breath caught, the air between them gone thick and warm as steam, until a steward cleared his throat in the doorway and the moment shattered like dropped glass. There was the evening he told her, low and rough, that her scent had started following him into rooms she'd never entered, clinging to his memory like smoke to wool, and she'd had to grip the table edge to keep her knees from doing something foolish. Each time, something interrupted. A council meeting, a messenger from the southern packs, Soren Hale, appearing in doorways at precisely the wrong second with her frost-white fur and her sharp, watchful eyes, smelling the air the way wolves do when they suspect a rival they can't yet name. He's not himself, Soren said one evening to Petra, in the kind of voice meant to sound like concern. Have you noticed? He hasn't requested a single candidate in 3 weeks. I've noticed. There's a rumor. Soren's fingers tightened on her wine glass, knuckles pale. About the tea servant. There's always a rumor. This one smells true. Soren's jaw tightened, a flash of something raw under the practiced calm, gone as fast as it came. I've watched him drink that woman's tea like it's the only thing keeping him upright. That isn't politeness, Petra. That's a man falling, and nobody bothered to ask the rest of us if we minded. Petra said nothing because she'd noticed the same thing, and because some traitorous part of her, the part that had failed to match this king for 19 weeks straight, had started, quietly, to hope. The jealousy beat landed on a Thursday, sharp and sudden as a struck match, and it came from a direction nobody expected. Mira had been sent to deliver tea to the eastern garden, where a visiting lord from the coastal packs, young, charming, entirely too pleased with himself, had cornered her near the rose trellis, complimenting her hands, her steadiness, the particular shade of her eyes in the afternoon light. He'd taken her wrist, lightly, the way men who'd never been told no often did, just to make a point about how a pretty thing like her shouldn't be hauling tea trays. I manage fine, Mira said, pulling her wrist free without raising her voice, calm as still water. She didn't see Calder until his shadow fell across the trellis, and by then the air had already changed, gone heavy and electric, cedar and rain scent rolling off him in a wave so thick it nearly knocked her back a step. His jaw was a hard line. His eyes had gone the particular gold black of a wolf, barely holding his shift in check. Lord Bren. His voice was quiet. Quiet was worse than shouting. Every wolf in that garden understood that instinctively. You're touching what isn't yours to touch. Your Grace, I only meant... I know exactly what you meant. Calder didn't move closer. He didn't have to. The growl underneath his words did the moving for him, low and rolling, the kind that made the hair lift on every arm within 20 feet. Leave the garden, now. Lord Bren left, quickly. Mira stood frozen for one full breath, watching the king's shoulders heave like he was fighting something down by force, his hands curled into fists at his sides, knuckles white. "That wasn't necessary," she said finally, once the silence had stretched too thin to bear. He turned to her, and what she saw in his face wasn't triumph. It was something closer to panic. A man who'd just watched himself do something he couldn't take back and didn't fully understand. "I couldn't stop it," he admitted, low. "The growl. I felt it before I decided to let it out. That should frighten me." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It doesn't, which frightens me more." He almost reached for her then. She watched his hand lift, watched it want to. But a steward's voice cut through the garden calling for the king's presence in the council chamber, and the moment broke again, the way it always did. The way it was starting to feel like the world itself was conspiring to keep them from finishing a single sentence that mattered. He left without a word. She stood among the roses a long time after, breathing slow, trying to convince her own heart to stop racing towards something she'd promised herself she wouldn't catch fire from. The breathing room didn't last. That night, alone in the small servants' room she shared with 2 other girls, Mira sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her wrist, the one Lord Bren had touched, against her own collarbone, as if she could scrub the memory off with pressure alone. It wasn't Bren's touch that lingered. It was the growl. The way Calder's restraint had nearly broken in public, over her, in front of a visiting lord who could make trouble for it. This is the part where I should be careful, she thought. This is exactly the part Petra warned me about. But carefulness had never once made her chest stop humming when she thought about cedar and rain, and she fell asleep that night without solving the problem, only deciding, quietly, stubbornly, to keep pouring tea, and let whatever was happening between them happen at whatever pace it wanted, because trying to dam a river rarely worked out better than letting it find its own bank. She woke the next morning with her flaw fully intact, the conviction that she could keep this contained, that she could want a king and still belong, fully, to herself. She had no idea yet how soon that conviction would be tested. The hidden truth surfaced 11 days later, and it came not from Calder, not from Mira, but from a letter Petra Ilsworth had been sitting on for nearly a month, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to use it. She found Mira in the herb pantry again, this time holding a folded paper with a wax seal Mira didn't recognize. The wolf and wheat crest of the eastern border holds stamped deep into red wax. "Your mother," Petra said, "was Lorena Ashgrove." Mira's hands went still over the dried sage. "She was Lorena Voss, my father's name. Before that." Petra's voice had gone careful, the way a woman speaks when she's about to drop something heavy and doesn't want it to shatter on landing. Lorena Ashgrove was the eldest daughter of the Ashgrove pack line, the line that held the eastern border holds before the Vesh kings absorbed them 3 generations back. A line with old bond magic in its blood, the kind that doesn't show itself in most descendants for generations, if ever. But when it does, it announces itself the way no ordinary mate pull does. Stronger, faster, undeniable. The pantry went very quiet. "You're telling me," Mira said slowly, "that I'm not just some girl who happens to smell good to him. I'm telling you the bond pull he felt the first day you set that teapot down wasn't ordinary luck." Petra's eyes were steady, almost gentle now. Ashgrove blood calls to Vesh blood, like calling to like. It's written in the old pack treaties, 300 years back, before your line scattered and went into hiding to escape a war that nearly wiped them out. He didn't fall for a tea servant, Mira. He fell for the last living thread of a bloodline his own great-grandfather signed a blood debt to, and never paid. Mira's heart was hammering now, loud enough she could hear it in her own ears. Does he know? No. Petra folded the letter shut. And that's the part you need to decide what to do with, because the moment this becomes public, and it will, eventually, these things always surface. Every noble in that court who spent 19 weeks watching him fail to choose a wife is going to say the only reason he wants you is the debt, the blood pull, not you. Mira sat down hard on the pantry stool, the world rearranging itself around her in ways she hadn't braced for. Because here was the gap that had been open since the very first page of this story. The listener had felt the pull from the first scent of cedar and rain, had felt something more humming under the surface of every almost moment. And now it had a name, and a weight, and a deadline. She had to decide, fast, what she believed, that she was loved, or that she was owed. She didn't go to him that night. She needed the silence first, needed to sit with the new shape of herself before she let anyone else touch it. And that, too, was part of her flaw, the part that mistook solitude for strength even when it cost her. Calder noticed her absence from the kitchens the next morning like a missing tooth. Wrong, raw, impossible to ignore. He found her instead 2 days later, in the garden, sitting very still among the same roses where he'd nearly lost his temper over Lord Bren, and something in her posture told him before her scent did that whatever was wrong had teeth. "You've been avoiding me," he said, sitting beside her without asking, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. "I've been thinking." Mira kept her eyes on the roses. "About what you'd say if I told you I might be the reason this bond hit you so hard. Not because the universe matched our souls for some poetic reason, because my blood owes your blood a debt 300 years old, and bonds like that don't ask permission. They just take." Calder went very still beside her. "Who told you that?" he said, voice gone flat. "Petra. She found the letter." He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something rougher, something that scraped on the way out. "I knew," he admitted. The garden went silent in a way that had nothing to do with birds or wind. "You knew?" Mira turned to face him fully now, and the betrayal in her voice was quiet but unmistakable. "How long?" 3 days. He met her eyes, didn't flinch from them. "Petra came to me first, before she came to you. I told her to bury it. Why? Because I was afraid." His hands curled against his knees, the same fists from the garden, the same restraint barely held. "Because I was afraid that the moment you knew you'd think exactly what you're thinking right now, that none of this was real, that I only wanted you because some dead ancestor signed his name to a debt he never paid." This was the moment the hero disappointed her, not through cruelty, but through silence, through deciding for her what she could and couldn't bear to know, and it landed in Mira's chest like a stone dropped down a well, the splash arriving long after the fall. "You don't get to decide what I can handle," she said, low and sharp enough to wound. "I have managed every hard truth in my life without a king softening the landing for me. I would have managed this one too. I know that now. Knowing it now doesn't undo 3 days of you deciding I was too fragile for my own history." He didn't argue. That, more than any apology, was what cracked something open in her. Because every man she'd ever known would have argued, would have explained himself into a corner. He just sat there, gold eyes steady, and let the silence carry his guilt instead of words. "I'm sorry," he said finally, rough. "Not for wanting you, for thinking I had the right to choose what truth you carried." It wasn't enough to fix it, but it was, she thought, a start. And starts mattered, in a world where most powerful men never bothered to make one. She walked away from that conversation without forgiving him fully, and the not fully forgiving was its own kind of ache, sharper somehow than open anger would have been. Word of the Ashgrove bloodline reached the wider court within the week anyway. These things always surfaced. Petra had been right about that. and the reaction split the palace down a fault line that had clearly been waiting under the surface all along. Soren Hale heard it at a dinner she hadn't been invited to, through a maid who owed her a favor, and felt something in her chest go cold, and then, strangely, almost relieved. "So it's not really her he wants," Soren said to Petra, 2 days later, in the same gallery where she'd first watched Lady Wren fail to win anything at all. "It's the debt, the blood. Anyone with Ashgrove blood would have pulled the same bond. It could have been me, if my line ran differently." "Could it have?" Petra said, and something in her dry tone made Soren's certainty wobble. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means bond pulls of that strength have happened exactly 4 times in 300 years of Vesh history, between exactly the right blood at exactly the right moment, and every single time, the king in question could have chosen any woman with that bloodline standing in front of him." Petra's eyes were sharp now, cutting through Soren's frost-white composure like a blade through silk. "He didn't choose blood, Lady Hale. Blood opened the door. He's the one who walked through it and stayed, week after week, long after the scandal could have given him every excuse to walk away clean. That's not debt, that's choice. Don't confuse the two just because it's easier to live with." Soren said nothing to that, but something in her chest, the part that had spent 4 weeks convinced she was the almost favorite, the part that had watched the king's eyes track a tea servant's back, and felt her own future die in real time, finally, quietly, let go of a hope she'd been holding too tight to name. She would not be cruel about it. That, at least, surprised even her. The court convened that Sunday for what was meant to be the 20th weekly presentation. A candidate from the northern packs, already dressed, already announced, already standing in the antechamber with her father's hand steady on her shoulder. She never made it through the doors. Calder stood at the head of the Hall of Petitions, the same hall where Mira had first set down a teapot and changed the shape of his life without meaning to, and he did not wait for the steward to announce the candidate's name. "Send her home," he said, "with my apologies and a gift for the journey. There will be no candidate today." The hall erupted into the particular hush that precedes a much louder noise. Nobles leaning toward each other, fans snapping open to hide whispering mouths. Petra Ilsworth going very still at the edge of the room with something that looked, for the first time in 19 weeks, almost like hope instead of dread. "Your Grace." A council elder stepped forward, gray-bearded, scent sharp with old authority. The Northern Alliance can expect whatever it likes." Calder's voice didn't rise, but it carried, the way a king's voice does when he's finally stopped performing patience he doesn't feel. "I have spent 19 weeks parading women through this hall to satisfy alliances and ledgers and matchmakers' quotas, and not one bond pull among them. Not one. I will not stand here and pretend a 20th name will succeed where 19 failed." "And what will you do instead?" The elder's voice had an edge now, testing. "Marry the tea servant? The whole court already whispers it's only the old debt speaking, not the man." The hall went silent enough to hear the fire crackling in the far hearth. This was the climax the listener had been waiting an hour for, the moment the title's promise either cashed out or collapsed. And Calder Vesh, Alpha King of Velmora, did not hesitate. "Bring her," he said. A steward bolted from the room before the king finished speaking, and the hall filled with the particular electric hush of people who sense history arriving and don't yet know its shape. Mira was in the kitchen when the steward found her, wrist deep in dried chamomile, and she went cold all the way through when he gasped out that the king wanted her. Now, in the main hall, in front of the full court, she did not have time to change. She did not have time to compose her face into something the nobles would approve of. She walked in wearing plain gray wool with flour dusted faintly on one sleeve, her hair coming loose from its pins, and every eye in that vast carved hall turned to track her the way they'd once tracked Lady Wren, Lady Corin, every nameless candidate before her. Except this time the air itself felt different, charged, waiting. Calder came down from the dais to meet her halfway across the floor. He did not wait for permission, did not perform distance for the council's sake. He took her hand in front of every noble who had once overlooked her, every matchmaker who'd written her off as below-stairs furniture, every rival who'd called her nothing but a debt finally come due. "They're saying," he said, low, just for her, though the whole hall strained to hear it, "that I only want you because of old blood and an unpaid debt." Her chin came up. "Do you? I wanted you before I knew your name had ever touched mine." His thumb moved once over her knuckles, slow, deliberate. "The debt explains why the bond hit so hard. It doesn't explain why I've spent 3 weeks finding excuses to walk past the kitchens twice a day. It doesn't explain why I haven't slept right since the night you bandaged my shoulder and told me bleeding standing was my choice. But the floor was yours." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite shock, moved through the gathered nobles. "This is madness," the gray-bearded elder said, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. "A king does not claim a serving girl in front of the realm on the strength of scent and stubbornness." "This king does." Calder didn't look away from Mira's face. "Watch me." The bond magic in that hall had been simmering for weeks, building under every almost moment, every interrupted silence, every restrained growl in a rose garden. And it chose that exact second to surface, the way old magic always does, on its own schedule and no one else's. Mira felt it first as warmth, low in her chest, spreading outward like tea steeping through water. And then as sound, a hum only she and Calder could hear, rising between them like a held note finally allowed to resolve. The scar through her eyebrow prickled, faint and strange. Calder's gold eyes flared brighter, just for a heartbeat, the way a wolf's eyes catch firelight. "You feel that?" he said, voice gone rough and quiet, no longer performing for the hall at all. "I feel that." Her own voice had gone thin, breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. The light in the room didn't change. No carved wolf on the walls came alive. No thunderclap split the ceiling. Bond seals were quieter than legend made them, more like a lock finally finding its key than a storm. But every wolf in that hall, every noble with shifter blood thin or thick, felt the air shift the way you feel a storm front pass even with your eyes shut, a held breath releasing, a debt, 300 years old, finally closing. Not with payment, but with choice. Soren Hale, watching from the gallery in her frost-white fur, felt the bond settle into the room like dust after a long fall, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that what rose in her chest wasn't envy. It was something closer to relief. The strange, clean relief of watching a question finally answered. Even one she'd hoped to answer herself. Petra Ilsworth pressed a hand flat against her own sternum, eyes wet, and did not bother hiding it. 19 weeks, she murmured. To no one, to everyone. 19 weeks, and it was the tea. "Say it," Calder said, low, his free hand coming up to rest against her jaw, careful, like she might still bolt. In front of all of them. "Tell me you choose this. I won't have anyone whispering later that the bond decided for you." Mira looked past his shoulder, at Petra's wet eyes, at Soren's quiet stillness, at the council elder's slowly softening face, at a hall full of people who had spent 19 weeks overlooking her entirely. Then she looked back at him, at cedar and rain, and the particular gold of his eyes in the hall's torchlight, and felt no fear at all, only the steady, certain warmth of a kettle finally come to boil. "I choose it," she said. "Not the debt, not the blood. You, the man who growled at a lord in a rose garden and hated himself for it after. The man who sat in my kitchen bleeding and let me tell him what to do. That man. I choose him." The hall didn't applaud. It did something rarer. It went utterly silent. The silence of a room that understands it has just watched something true happen in a place built for so much performance. Calder's jaw worked once, twice, the way it did when feeling outran his ability to speak it cleanly. "Then hear it," he said, turning to the hall without releasing her hand, his voice carrying to every gilded corner. "I name Mira Voss, of the Ashgrove line, my mate and my queen, by bond and by choice, and any man or woman in this court who still wishes to whisper otherwise may say it to my face." No one said anything to his face. Later, much later, after the council had dispersed in stunned clusters, and the gossip had already started racing through every corridor in the palace faster than any steward could carry it, Mira found herself back in the kitchen, alone, for just a few minutes, because some habits don't unmake themselves in an afternoon. She put the kettle on. Old habit, steady hands. Calder found her there exactly the way she knew he would, leaning in the doorway with his crown still slightly askew from where the steward had hastily replaced it, watching her with an expression that had finally, fully, stopped performing for anyone. "You could have 100 servants doing this for you now," he said. "I know." She counted the steam, 3 curls, then pour, the same way she had the very first day, before any of this had a name. "I like making it myself." He crossed the kitchen, slow, unhurried, and the scent of him, cedar, rain, no fear left underneath it now, just warmth, wrapped around her the way it had the very first time. Except this time she didn't have to pretend she wasn't affected by it. This time she let her breath catch, let her hand still over the cup, let him see exactly what he did to her. "I disappointed you," he said quietly, against her hair. "Hiding the truth. I won't promise I'll never make that mistake again. I'd be lying, and I'm done lying to you. But I'll promise to choose better, every time after." "That's all I ever wanted you to promise." She turned in his arms, tea forgotten, steam curling unattended between them. Not perfection, just honesty, even when it's hard to give. He kissed her then, slow, certain, no audience left to perform for, just warmth and cedar and the low hum of a bond finally, fully settled, and somewhere in the kitchen the kettle began, softly, to sing. Outside, in a court that had spent 19 weeks watching a king fail to choose, the whisper had already changed shape, already begun the long journey from scandal to legend, the way all true things eventually do. He brought a different woman every week, and then she started pouring the tea, and he never looked at anyone else again. It was, by the time the story finished traveling from mouth to mouth, almost exactly true. Almost. Because the truth, the real one, the one only Mira and Calder would ever fully carry, was smaller and stranger, and far more ordinary than legend. A girl who liked the quiet of a kitchen, a king who'd stopped believing he could feel a pull at all, and 1 cup of tea poured by steady hands that had never once been trying to win anything. She hadn't been trying to be chosen. She simply hadn't run when he finally looked.